3 seconds after the Neanderthal and the Homo sapiens made contact, the virus stopped caring which species it was in. It just kept doing what it had always done. Replicating, persisting, moving. That was roughly 55,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now the Middle East or Central Asia. And neither of them had any idea what was happening at the microscopic level. They had no germ theory, they had no medicine, they had no concept of infection. They just had the moment, and the virus had the rest. Here is the thing about sexually transmitted diseases that almost nobody thinks to question. We treat them as a modern problem, a civilization problem, something that came with cities, with population density, with the particular mess of large numbers of humans living on top of each other, with nowhere to put the consequences. We imagine ancient humans as rough, yes, short-lived, yes, occasionally eaten by things, but clean in some fundamental sense, uncomplicated. The kind of people who had no time for the specific indignities we associate with modern sexual health. That picture is wrong, not slightly wrong, not in a minor technical sense. Wrong at the foundation because the organisms we now know as sexually transmitted infections are, in many cases, older than our species. Some of them were already inside our ancestors before the first anatomically modern human ever took a breath. The diseases we find most awkward to discuss were not created by civilization. They predate it by hundreds of thousands of years. Some of them predate us entirely, and the way scientists figured this out is stranger than the diseases themselves. For a long time, even researchers operated within a version of this comfortable picture. The focus of paleopathology, the study of ancient disease, was on things like trauma and infection from wounds and parasites from food and water. Sexually transmitted infections felt too modern, too social, too tied to the particular complexity of large populations to have deep prehistoric roots. The working belief was that civilization brought scale, and scale brought the transmission networks that made these diseases possible. It was a reasonable thing to believe. It just turned out to be wrong. That idea collapsed the moment genomics gave researchers a way to read the evolutionary history of viruses directly from their DNA. And once they could do that, the timeline started stretching backward in a way nobody fully expected. One by one, organisms we thought of as products of modern life turned out to have roots reaching back into deep time. The further back researchers looked, the older the story got. And the older the story got, the more the original picture fell apart. Let's go back. All the way back. To understand what happened, you need to understand one thing about how viruses evolve. They mutate constantly, their genomes change at a predictable average rate. This means that if you have two strains of the same virus found in two different populations or species, you can compare their genomes and calculate roughly how long ago they shared a common ancestor. The further back that shared ancestor, the longer the virus has been diverging. It is essentially a clock written in mutations. And when researchers applied this to the viruses responsible for some of today's most common sexually transmitted infections, the clock read numbers that completely reframed the question. Herpes simplex virus type 2. That is the kind associated with genital herpes. Most people know it exists. Fewer people think about where it came from. Researchers analyzing the evolutionary history of HSV-2 traced the viral lineage backward, comparing strains across species looking for the divergence point. What they found is now part of the established record of viral evolution. Approximately 1.6 million years ago, HSV-2 jumped from a primate host into the Homo genus, not Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, a species that would not become us for another million years and more. 1.6 million years ago, our ancestors were not painting cave walls. They were not making complex tools. They were not using fire in any controlled way. They were, by any standard we usually apply to ancient humans, extremely early. And herpes was already with them. It had jumped species, found a compatible host, established itself in a new population, and started adapting. By the time anatomically modern humans appeared, roughly 300,000 years ago, according to current fossil evidence, HSV-2 was not a new arrival. It was an ancient resident of the hominid world, already adapted, already persistent, already doing exactly what it still does today. Consider what that meant for any individual living through it. No name for the condition, no category, no explanation. Something recurring, painful, confusing, and completely outside any framework that could account for it. A person 800,000 years ago experiencing an HSV-2 outbreak had no way to know it was a virus, no way to know it was transmitted, no way to know why it came back, why it left, why some people had it and others did not. They simply lived through it. with no way to explain what was happening. And they carried that experience alone with it in a world where there was no language yet for what was happening to them, and no one who could offer anything more useful than a guest wrapped in ritual. The part that tends to land hardest is not that herpes existed in ancient times. It is that it existed before humans were humans in the full sense. The diseases were not something civilization created. Some of them were there waiting, already adapted to hominid biology, long before our species had a name for itself. By the time our species appeared, the microscopic world had already been evolving alongside hominid biology for millions of years. And then there is what happened when Homo sapiens finally met the Neanderthals. Imagine a group of Homo sapiens moving northeast out of Africa, roughly 55,000 to 60,000 years ago. Small groups, probably, hunters, moving through terrain already occupied, in patchy and contested ways, by Neanderthal populations who had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. The two groups met. Not once, not briefly. Genomic evidence has now confirmed what researchers suspected for years and what earlier researchers would have found genuinely shocking. There was sustained interbreeding. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together, not as a one-time accident, but as a recurring pattern across thousands of years and multiple regions. The evidence is still in you. If you are of non-African ancestry, you carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That is a measurable fraction of your genome that came from a different species of human, preserved through 50-something thousand years of reproduction. Every cell in your body still carries a tiny record of that meeting. You can test for it. People do. Interbreeding means exactly what it sounds like. And where there is interbreeding, there is more than DNA moving between populations. Herpes simplex virus type 1, primarily associated with oral herpes, shows genomic signatures in modern human populations that a research team analyzed in depth in 2017. Their work suggested that the HSV1 strains most prevalent in modern humans carried genetic patterns consistent with a transmission event from archaic human populations, potentially Neanderthals or Denisovans during the interbreeding window. This remains a hypothesis rather than a proven fact. The genetic case is suggestive, not conclusive, but it tells us that the same events that mixed our DNA with theirs may also have mixed our viral passengers. The viruses, like the genes, found new hosts when the populations found each other. And unlike the genes, the viruses left no record anyone could read for 50,000 years. They simply kept going, silently from host to host, across the entire subsequent history of our species, right down to the present. This is where the story starts to feel less like ancient history and more like a mechanism that never really stopped. Syphilis is a story that has been actively argued about by researchers for decades, and it is still not fully resolved. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation was specific. Columbus brought syphilis back from the Americas in 1492. European sailors made contact with indigenous populations, and within a few years, a devastating epidemic was spreading across Europe. Columbus returns. Epidemic follows. The timeline appeared to hold together, and for a long time the explanation held with it. Then the bones started complicating things. Beginning in the 1990s, paleopathologists examining European skeletal remains began finding lesions. Specific kinds of lesions, in specific locations on specific bones, in patterns consistent with treponema disease. Treponema infections are a family that includes syphilis, yaws, Pioz, and related conditions. They leave characteristic marks on bone that specialists can identify, and some of these marked skeletons were predating 1492 by enough of a margin that the Columbus explanation had a serious problem. If syphilis arrived exclusively on Columbus's ships, it should not be in European bones that are older than Columbus. And yet, the debate that followed was not quick, and it has not ended. One position holds that the pre-Columbian European evidence represents different treponemal infections, not syphilis specifically, and that the Columbus hypothesis still holds for the epidemic strain. Another position argues that the distinction between strains is too fine to draw reliably from skeletal evidence alone. A major ancient DNA study published in 2020 attempted to resolve this by tracing the evolutionary history of the pathogen family directly from archaeological remains. The results leaned towards supporting American origins for the epidemic strain, but sample sizes were limited and geographic gaps remained significant. As of the current scientific literature, the question has a leading candidate answer and a set of problems that candidate cannot fully explain. That is not a verdict. That is a status update. What we can say without controversy is that syphilis, or something very closely related to it, existed in human populations across multiple continents long before any ships crossed any oceans. It did not need Columbus to exist. Columbus may have changed the epidemiological picture in Europe, but the organism was not created by the encounter. Now here is the turn that requires a brief moment of appreciation for how quietly absurd biology can be. Human papillomavirus, HPV, the most common sexually transmitted infection in the world by most measures. Hundreds of strains. Most sexually active adults will encounter it at some point in their lives. Many will never know. Some strains are low consequence. Some are associated with cancers. It is ubiquitous in the modern human population in a way that no disease with a recent origin could possibly explain. Researchers studying HPV's evolutionary history found something that reframes the entire category. HPV did not jump to humans from another species at some identifiable point. It did not emerge from some isolated population under unusual conditions. It co-evolved with hominids. The major lineages of the virus appear to have been diverging in hominid populations for hundreds of thousands of years, with some estimates pushing the timeline back beyond 1 million years. Every time the hominid host population split or migrated or interbred with another group, the virus went along for the ride. Every selective pressure that shaped our immune system also shaped what the virus was adapting to. The relationship between HPV and hominids is not infection in the usual sense. It is closer to a partnership of the most involuntary kind. A study published in 2017 in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution traced HPV-16, one of the highest risk strains, through its genetic history and found patterns consistent with ancient transmission events between archaic and modern human populations, likely during the same interbreeding periods that transferred Neanderthal DNA into our genome. In other words, the same encounters that gave some of us Neanderthal cheekbones may also have transferred strains of HPV that are still circulating in human populations today. HPV was present before agriculture, before language, probably before the first shelter was built, before the first fire was controlled, before any human had any concept of medicine or the possibility that invisible things could cause visible suffering. Every generation of humans that has ever lived encountered it. It is not a disease of modernity, it is a disease of being human. And being human is a category considerably older than civilization or anything else we tend to associate with the word modern. One companion has an even stranger origin story, and it requires a moment of patience, because where it goes is genuinely uncomfortable. Thephyris pubis, the pubic louse, is a small parasitic insect. It lives in coarse body hair. It is transmitted through close physical contact. It has been found in the combs of ancient Egypt and in medieval skeletal remains. It is, by every measure, an extremely old human companion of the worst kind. Researchers studying the evolutionary genetics of lice published their findings in 2007 in the journal BMC Biology. They traced the divergence of pubic lice from their closest relatives. That closest relative is the louse that lives on gorillas. The split happened approximately 3.3 million years ago. 3.3 million years. At that point in time, Homo sapiens did not exist. Homo erectus did not exist. The genus Homo had barely differentiated from the common ancestor we share with other great apes. The hominid walking around 3.3 million years ago was something more like Australopithecus, bipedal, small-brained, stone tool adjacent at best. There were no languages, no fire, no tools beyond the most basic. And yet there was already a parasite with us that has never left. It adapted to our body hair. It specialized in our particular biology. And it has been traveling with every generation since, through every migration, every population bottleneck, every continent our lineage eventually reached. Some ancestor of ours came into contact with gorillas, in a way intimate enough to transfer parasites. Genetic evidence strongly supports this conclusion. There is no polite way to discuss the precise mechanism, but it is documented, and it has been part of the human story for longer than the human story has had a name. If that makes you feel slightly less judgmental about your ancestors' other choices, the feeling is probably warranted. There's one more layer that is easy to overlook. What did ancient humans actually know about any of this? The honest answer is that we have clear evidence they noticed. We have no evidence they understood. The Ebers Papyrus is an Egyptian medical document dating to approximately 1550 BCE, one of the oldest surviving medical texts. It contains descriptions of complaints in the genital region and recommended treatments involving substances and methods that no modern physician would endorse, but that represent genuine systematic observation. Something was happening. Patterns were being noticed. The text describes without fully understanding, which is exactly what observation looks like before mechanism is available. Ancient Greek and Roman medical writing describes conditions that scholars have tentatively connected to what we now call sexually transmitted infections. Though the mapping is always uncertain, ancient medicine categorized disease differently, understood causes differently, and did not have access to anything like germ theory. The idea that invisible living organisms were responsible for disease did not become scientific consensus until the 19th century. Before that, the mechanism was entirely opaque. All anyone had was pattern recognition. This symptom follows that kind of contact. This remedy seems to help. This behavior seems to make things worse. What that left ancient people with was a set of observations they had no way to correctly interpret. They could see that something spread between people. They could see that it followed certain kinds of contact. They could see that some individuals were more affected than others, and that certain periods were worse than others. But without germ theory, without microscopy, without any concept of a pathogen, the frameworks available for making sense of this were entirely wrong. Explanations involved divine punishment, imbalances of bodily humors, environmental factors, moral failing. The observations were real. The interpretations were not. For ancient humans in the Paleolithic, before writing, before any surviving record, we cannot say what they knew or thought or attributed their experiences to. We can say they had the diseases. The genomic and paleopathological evidence for that is solid. What happened to individual people as a result? How communities responded, what frameworks they used to make sense of it, whether they connected cause and effect at all in anything resembling a useful way. That is gone. The lived experience of disease in prehistory is almost entirely lost. What remains is biological evidence. The pathogens themselves, their evolutionary histories written in DNA, and occasional marks left on bones that we can now dig up and read thousands of years later. The narrative of ancient humans as somehow prior to the complications of physical life has always been a projection. We imagined our ancestors living in a state of clean simplicity because that picture was useful, because it served as a contrast to what felt like the particular mess of modernity. But the biology has its own record, and the biology shows something different. The diseases were there. The organisms were there. In some cases, they were there before we were fully human. And in all cases, our ancestors were dealing with them without any of the tools we now take for granted. No antibiotics, no antivirals, no understanding of germ theory, no way to know what was happening inside their own bodies at the microscopic level. Imagine experiencing a persistent, recurring, painful condition with no framework for understanding what it was, no treatment that actually worked, and no community knowledge base that could even accurately describe what was happening, let alone explain it. That was the situation for every person who encountered any of these organisms across hundreds of thousands of years before written medicine existed. Not just some people. Every person, every generation. These diseases are not the price we paid for civilization. They were already waiting long before civilization ever existed. Our relationship with them is not a modern crisis. It is an ancient negotiation that has never actually ended, just changed forms as both sides kept evolving. We developed antivirals. We built global health infrastructure capable of things our ancestors could not have imagined. And the organisms that were circulating in Homo erectus 1.6 million years ago are still here, still doing what they always did, still finding hosts, still persisting. They are a sign of being alive, which, it turns out, has always been considerably more complicated than the clean version of the story ever suggested. If this changed how you think about what your ancestors were actually carrying, leave a comment and tell me which part landed hardest. Subscribe, because we do this every week, and the story that got left out of the clean version is usually the most interesting one. Your ancestors did not get the sanitized edition. You should not have to either.